Julia's book launch. It's a personal delight to host Julia's book launch tonight. I had the pleasure of examining the earlier version, her Oxford DPhil thesis, and it's wonderful to see how it's grown into an even more impressive analysis of women's activism in dangerous contexts. And it's one of the most theoretically sophisticated and empirically rich studies of its kind, and challenging some of the common assumptions about collective action and providing convincing alternative accounts. It is, in short, a must read and is available from Rutgers University Press this month, in fact, any day now. At present, Julia holds research fellowships at Oxford and at UNAM in Mexico, and she's working on a comparative study of women's high-risk leadership in Mexico, El Salvador, and Colombia. She's also had extensive research and practitioner experience along the Colombia-Venezuelan border. So lots to discuss. Over to you, Julia, to tell us about your research.
Thank you so much for those kind words, Maxine. I'm just going to click on and share my slides here. Can everyone see them?
Sure.
Yeah? Great. Well, thank you again, Maxine. Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you, Oscar, for hosting me for this book launch. As I was saying to Maxine, just as we were getting ready here, it's been a long time coming, and it's a project that has really benefited from years of generosity and sharing and debate and discussion with many of you who are here today. So I'm really proud to share it with you. But I also want to thank you for your involvement in the writing and development of this research. As Maxine said, the book is called High Risk Feminism in Colombia, Women's Mobilization in Violent Contexts. And I think it should be shipping around the world, including to Colombia. So I have my copy here, and I hope that your copies can start to come through as well. I'm going to begin by reading a snippet from the beginning of the book, which really kind of bookends, if I can say that, the research that I did over the last few years, starting in 2015. I would say ending in 2018 or 2019, but as Maxine mentioned, it's a project that seems to continue. So I don't know that I can ever say it's over, but over in the sense of what's been included in the book. So I'll just get into it. Angela and I were sitting on a bus, traveling from Turbaco to Barranquilla, when she decided to share her story with me. We had met a few months earlier when I first arrived in Colombia, and although we had spent lots of time together, she had never chosen to open up to me about her past. Originally from the Magdalena province, she and her husband were displaced from the countryside to an urban center after her family members were murdered by paramilitaries. It was in Barranquilla that her husband was killed, and she had to move to El Pozón, a slum near Cartagena, with her children. And this was where she joined the Liga de Mujeres Desplazadas, the League of Displaced Women, and moved into the City of Women, which I'll talk about in a moment. Her second husband was later murdered on the doorstep of her house when their youngest child was only 6 months old. She told me about the early days of the city, when the women continued to be threatened by armed groups. Her words were clear. Despite so much pain, so many violations, so much damage, the voice of us women has always survived. We had woken up early that day, and we were en route to a rally where women from all over the Caribbean coast would come together to express their support for the peace accords negotiated between the Colombian government and the FARC rebels. It was a moment of expectation, full of hopeful symbols, women wearing white, images of doves of peace, T-shirts with brightly colored messages of see, yes. Angela told me that she had been reflecting on what the day meant to her. Behind every smile, there is a story. So this is when I began my research in 2016. And actually, I think my mom might be on this call, on this Zoom call, and she may recognize it because she was dragged to that meeting with us. And this is a picture of a mural that I took in 2019 at the other end of the country. So years later, at the opposite end of the country, Sandra and I were sitting in the office of a local government employee in southern Putumayo, near the border with Ecuador. The oscillating fan on the desk created a background of white noise, that at times made it hard to hear her, particularly when her voice lowered as she spoke about her memories of the past. I asked her if she could tell me a little bit about how she'd come to join the Alianza de Mujeres Tejedores de Vida, Women's Alliance of Putumayo. She delved into a story that involved kidnap and sexual abuse as a young woman. It was this experience that eventually led her to join the Alianza, where she was finally able to talk to other women about her experiences and find solidarity in group membership. For her, the traumas of the past were an intrinsic part of the reason why she joined. Being part of this organization is dangerous for Sandra today. She told me that only a few months before, armed men had entered her house and told her that unless she stopped her community work and joined them, they would kill both her and her daughters. While our conversation focused on resistance and resilience, it was clear that times were tense. As soon as we left the building, we were accompanied by her government-issued bodyguards who followed us, a few paces behind, as we walked to a small restaurant located on the edge of the town's central plaza. The next time I met up with Sandra in late 2019, she was no longer in the south by the border. The threats had become too much and she had been forced to displace herself to the departmental capital. So these two stories come from different moments of the so-called aftermath of Colombia's armed conflict. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the history, but for those who aren't as familiar, Colombia has been in a series of armed conflicts for much of its history. However, between 2012 and 2016, the government of Colombia and the FARC, the largest rebel group at the time, negotiated a peace process, which was signed in 2016, shortly after my mom and I were at that rally in Barranquilla. And during the armed conflict, we know that gendered violence was widespread. Of the almost 9 million people who are recognized through the country's victims unit, the Transitional Justice Mechanism, 4.5 million are women. And we know that there are 34,000 cases of sexual violence, although this is likely a very low estimate because of problems around reporting. However, even since the armed conflict between the FARC and the government, it officially ended in 2016, we've seen the reconfiguration of the armed conflict since then, meaning that new and old groups are filling the power vacuums that the FARC left behind, looking for social and territorial control, and particularly over control of illegal economies around coca, around illegal gold, around other kinds of illegal economies. And in this moment, this reconfiguration, we know that social leaders and human rights defenders continue to be at risk. So INDIPAS, which is a think tank in Colombia, has registered the murders of 59 social leaders in 2022 alone, leading to a total of over 1,000 murders since the peace was officially signed. What we also know about conflict more broadly is that conflict is gendered. So the late Cynthia Coburn wrote that men and women die different deaths and they're tortured and abused in different ways in war, because of the physical differences between the sexes and because of the different meanings culturally ascribed to the male and female body. She also talks about the continuum of violence, meaning that even when these peace processes and these peace negotiations are signed, it doesn't necessarily mean the end of war. She says that sometimes the post-war period is better called interbellum, a pause between fighting, before fighting begins again. And another quote that I think is important comes from the Colombian Historical Memory Center. And they talk about particularly the armed conflict on the coast, on the Caribbean coast, where Angela and the Liga are from. And they say that women and girls, dehumanized and dispossessed of their own bodies, became territories to be colonized by all powerful masculinities who declared themselves the victors through acts of brutality. So we see here that not only are conflicts around the world gendered, but we see in particular the specific ways, or we will talk about the specific ways in which the Colombian conflict has been gendered, meaning that women and girls experience conflict in different ways. So the research puzzle that came out of this years ago was that in the face of these risks of ubiquitous and gendered violence during both conflict and nominally post-conflict moments, we may assume that women turn inwards to the private domain of the household for protection and safety. This could be a function of the fear of violence against them, socially dictated norms around gender roles, social isolation and lack of resources. We may predict that they don't have the ability or the knowledge or the experience with mobilizing, and so it might make more sense to stay at home. But when I started doing my research in Colombia, it became very quickly clear that this is not always the case. So the question then that guides this research project, my DPhil, and also the book, is how do we explain why women put themselves directly in harm's way by mobilizing? And why, when the response to acting collectively, participating in these organizations, could be stalking, violence, threats, murders, threats against their children, why do women decide to assume these risks? So as I mentioned, when I moved to Colombia and I started doing my work, it became very quickly clear that women's movements are very visible in the streets, in the media, in the courts, in neighborhoods. So rather than violence necessarily presenting an obstacle or a disincentive to them mobilizing, in fact, in some cases, it actually gave rise to a specific kind of gendered resistance in which some women made gendered calculations about particularly gendered risks and decided to mobilize. And the focus of this book is these local, grassroots, really local organizations that did choose to act collectively and resist for gender justice in high-risk settings. As I mentioned, the country has a long history of women's mobilization, often around peace processes, and there's quite a bit of literature around there. We've also seen that there are women who mobilize as revolutionaries within the FARC. The FARC itself was about 30% women. We also see that women mobilize as mothers. We can think of the historical example of the Madres de Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, but we also saw this in Colombia. However, what I saw in Colombia, in the cases that I was working with, was not exactly peace mobilization or mothers mobilization. It specifically was not revolutionary, women as revolutionaries. It was actually women mobilizing for women's rights and for gender justice more broadly. However, in contesting these violent dynamics, they compounded the violences to which they're exposed, and the threats become twofold. The first is that women are daring to disturb imposed social order by non-state armed groups. So what that means is that when groups like the paramilitaries, the AUC, or groups like the FARC or the ELN went into these communities, they often not only wanted territorial control so that they could control what was happening in terms of drug trafficking, in terms of having, this piece of territory that belonged to them, but they also wanted social control. They also wanted the communities that they were taking over, that they were dominating, to obey them and to obey their rules. And so in mobilizing as groups of women, these women were actually saying that they weren't going to listen to these different armed groups. And that's the first risk. However, the second risk is that women were transgressing socially acceptable gender norms about what it means to be a woman in these communities in the first place. As I mentioned, the armed groups operated on these logics of militarized masculinity. And so for them, there was a very clear role clear understanding about what women's role is. That's to be mothers in the house, cooking, cleaning. That's not to be participating collectively or politically and making demands. And I would add here actually that maybe the third violence to which they were exposed is that not only were they opposing these armed groups, not only were they women who were opposing these armed groups, but they were also making demands for women's rights and for gender justice. They learned through participation in these organizations, which I'm going to talk about in a second, that they had rights as women and that the violences that they were suffering in the context of the armed conflict was because of their socially ascribed location as women. And so they were contesting that. And so what we've seen in earlier social movement studies is that severe repression can actually stimulate collective action sometimes in terms of causing demobilization. And Mara Loveman wrote about this in the Southern Cone in the late 90s. What I argue in the book is that the reason we see what I call high-risk feminist mobilization, high risk because of those three factors that I just mentioned, has to do with the creation of a bond between a particular kind of charismatic leader, an auspicious leader, and a population that's looking for that guidance, for that leadership. This dynamic is consistent with what Madsen and Snow, in a book that they wrote in the 90s, call the charismatic bond, which is a connection formed between a particular type of leader and a community that's struggling to cope. The leader has to have the ability to convince people to mobilize, despite the risks associated with doing so. And she does so by highlighting that in a domain of losses, which I'll explain in a second, even inaction doesn't guarantee safety. And therefore, the material and non-material benefits of collective action actually make mobilizing worth it, despite that extra level of risk that it may entail. So what she does is she orchestrates collective actions that lead to small successes over time. And in this way, participants are reassured that their participation has the ability to modify their day-to-day experiences of conflict. The ensuing collective action is shaped around ideas of gender justice, projects that aim to improve or ameliorate the situation of women by restoring their ability to live dignified lives. So within the context of high risk, there's the need for this charismatic leader who has the foresight to develop a charismatic bond through creative and strategic framing of the benefits of doing so. And in doing so, she turns fear, women's fear of violence, into feelings of anger or resistance, which other studies have shown changes their ability or their willingness to mobilize. So effectively, what I'm saying here is that even though women know that staying in the house, not sticking their necks out, may be a little bit safer for them, the risks of simply being a citizen, being a woman in these occupied communities is high enough. They may just be walking in the street, they may be in their homes, and they may experience violence simply because they're women living in communities that are controlled. And so yes, joining a women's organization, sticking their necks out, shining a light on what they're doing by making demands may mean that they are taking on or assuming further risk. But if you assess these comparatively, whereby the risks of not mobilizing aren't actually zero, and the risks of mobilizing are slightly higher, this differential here can be overcome when a specific leader says and shows and highlights the potential benefits of doing so. And those benefits can be non-material, so those can be feelings of identity, feelings of solidarity, feelings of knowing that you're not alone as a woman, that the experiences of violence that you've suffered didn't just happen to you because of anything that has to do with you, but because of a larger war strategy. And then also material benefits. And I'm going to talk about those in a sec as I go through the examples. But for example, being able to apply for projects together, being able to apply as collective victims through the country's transitional justice mechanisms, being able to hold events or to participate in the peace process as a collective. Those kinds of material benefits in conjunction with those non-material benefits really make that risk assessment or that risk calculation justifiable, despite the fact that at face value, it does look like, and it is this high risk feminism that can, as I said, bring with it increased risks of more violence or even death. So, as I mentioned, directed by a charismatic leader, women operating in these conditions of violence strategically engage with 4 pillars of action. I'm not going to go into all of them. You can read them in the book, but what they look like are the creation of collective identity, the building of social capital, which is both internal to the group and also external to other actors who have the potential to support those material benefits I was talking about. Using strategic and legal framing. So effectively using the language of the state, the laws that the state has, the sentences that the Constitutional Court has made, the autos that reflect international agendas. So for example, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and turn those into local sets of action. Using that language, the women are able to frame their experiences and then make demands on the state for rights that they're entitled to, and that in fact the state has responsibilities to offer them. And then fourthly, certification. So holding these events and engaging in activities that make them a legitimate actor, not only before the state, but before other actors in society. So for example, holding sit-ins, holding takeovers of public offices, engaging in public facing activities that make them not just, the women who are doing something, but a legitimate actor whose demands need to be taken seriously. And in doing so, they contest their violent surroundings and demand a more gender-just society. They turn their fear into resistance, which shifts their perspectives on risk-taking. And so what I'm going to do now for the remainder of the presentation is to go through the 4 cases that I talk about in the book, that I detail in the book. The first 3 are in Turbaco, which I mentioned. This is Angela's case. The second is in Bogota, in Usme, a neighborhood in the south, where I worked with an organization of Afro-Colombian women. The third is what we call a negative case. And it doesn't mean negative in the sense that they did something wrong or negative in terms of a judgment, so much as it's a really similar population. It's the same type of group, yet we didn't see the high-risk feminist mobilization. And in understanding what factors were or weren't present, that helps us understand what it does take to engage in high-risk feminism. And then fourthly, we go back to Sandra and the case of the Alianza in Putumayo in the south of the country to really interrogate a little bit more what Cynthia Coburn was telling us about that continuum of violence that extends beyond the pre-conflict conflict moment and extends beyond into this nominally post-conflict moment where women are still experiencing ongoing kinds of violence. I'm going to tell these in terms of stories, in terms of the narrative of these four organizations, but I do detail within the chapters all of those four pillars of action that I just mentioned earlier. So here, this picture is a woman, a contact of mine in the city of women in Turbaco, Bolívar. And so as I hinted at when I talked about Angela's story, on the Caribbean coast in Colombia, we know that in the late 90s and early 2000s, the paramilitary incursion, which led to real clashes between areas that had been previously or had ongoing control of the FARC, the leftist FARC. There was these heightened situations of violence through the Montes de Maria, through other areas along the Caribbean coast. And what we saw was women from all around this area began to be displaced by acts of violence, by massacres, and they started to arrive in Cartagena, which was one of the biggest urban hubs in the area. But they arrived often newly widowed, often with children, to some of the poorest areas of the city, to a place called El Pozón, a slum. El Pozón means the big well, and that really reflects some of the environmental vulnerabilities that they were exposed to. As it rained, when hurricane season came, El Pozón filled up with water, and this is where women were living. It was also an area that was controlled by other crime groups, other criminal bands who were operating and continuing to make these women's lives dangerous and exposed to violence, even though they had left the original site, their original homes. As I arrived to El Pozón, what we saw is that a woman, Patricia Guerrero, a lawyer, showed up, and she started to see that small groups of women were engaging in really small organizing. So for example, what they were doing was that some women would come together and they would each share a bit of food to make a soup, to make a sancocho. So one woman would bring a carrot, one woman would bring a piece of chicken, another would bring a potato. They'd put these in a pot and they'd make a soup that they could share that would then stretch out to feed all of their children. And what Patricia Guerrero started doing is she started talking to these women not only about their practical needs, the needs to feed their kids, the needs to clothe their needs to clothe their kids, their needs to have their children have a roof over their head, but also about what was going on in terms of their rights. As I mentioned before, the fact that they had suffered this violence wasn't their fault. It wasn't an individual or isolated incident. It was actually part of a broader strategy that armed groups were imposing on these communities. She also started to tell them about the rights that they had under law as women. Rights around reparation if they'd been displaced, rights to seek justice if they had experienced sexual violence. And she started to get them together and started to get them organizing. And this is where the Liga de Mujeres Desplazadas, the League of Displaced Women, was formed in 1998. Over time, as they got to know each other, they began to create these bonds of solidarity. Patricia Guerrero asked them, what is it that they really wanted? What was the big thing that would restore their dignity? She talks about their sueño de una vida digna, their dream of a dignified life. And they said, we've had our homes taken away from us. What we really want are our homes back. And so they decided to form and to build the City of Women. The City of Women is, you see it here, it's a humble area in the outskirts of Cartagena in a municipality called Turbaco. And what the women started to do is they started to look for funds. And eventually Patricia, through her connections with some US senators, managed to get money through USAID to get the funds to build this house. And then the women themselves learned how to make bricks. They learned how to raise and prepare soil. They learned how to build houses. And with the support of work people that they hired, they built this City of Women, which is a little, now it's bigger, but it was at the time a little kind of conjunto, a little neighborhood of around 100 houses that the women owned. The women had the titles and the deeds to these houses, and they could move in there with their children and reestablish their dignity, in their own words, after they had been displaced. This was not a low-risk activity. As they were building the town, as they were building the city, they were receiving threats. They were receiving threats against themselves because this area was well known to be strategic for other paramilitary groups and criminal bands. At one point, one of their husbands was killed as he was serving as a watchman over the brick factory. The women continued to experience violence and suffer violence, but they persisted. And they persisted, again, in this way that they framed the building of these houses, the building of this city, as an assertion of gender justice, as an assertion of their rights as women to have their homes that were taken away from them, to reestablish those and to rebuild those within a framework of women's rights to live lives free from violence. And this is what they do. They now live in the city. They continue to mobilize, although another story for another day. I think that their mobilization is diminishing slightly because they haven't had huge successes over the last few years. But they live here and they continue to participate as to demand their collective reparations from the government and to have justice reinstated in their lives in other ways. So this is the story of the Liga de Mujeres Desplazadas. We're going to move now to a different part of the country, to Bogota, the nation's capital, to Uzme, which is a locality, kind of a neighborhood or one of the political divisions within Bogota. It's in the south of the city. It's known to be very economically deprived, and it's known to be a home for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of people who were displaced from all over the country. And in the case that I'm talking about, we're talking about women who were displaced from the Pacific coast. Again, another site where there were clashes between armed groups, where there were mass displacements, massacres, widespread sexual violence. And so lots of these women displaced themselves from Chocó, from different parts of Valle, from different provinces all up and down the coast, and came and arrived, again, often lonely, often without any social connections, in the big city. The other thing, and I talk about this in the book, is not only were these women poor and displaced and often widowed, but they were also Black. And in Colombia, being Black or an Afro-Colombian person brings with it another intersection of discrimination. Colombians often talk about Colombia not being a racist country, but a classist country. But I would say that if you were to speak to these women of Afro-Mupas, they would beg to differ. So they came to the city where they often wouldn't even be rented out houses, or they wouldn't even be offered jobs, simply for being Afro-Colombian women and for being displaced. And amidst this, what we saw is that Maria Eugenia Urrutia, who was a leader, she had been a leader at home, she had come from a family of leaders, decided to create an organization of Afro-Colombian women, which she called Afro-Mupas, which in English translates around to Afro-Colombian Women for Peace. And what they started to do is they came together, again, like the women of the Liga. They formed these bonds of solidarity. They used their traditional and ancestral practices and processes to engage in healing and sanación projects so that they could overcome the sexual violences that they had experienced and the other violences that they experienced, but based in their own cultural traditions. They also managed to get themselves considered collective victims of reparation. So that means that through the victims unit, they not only are supposed to receive money individually for the crimes that they've suffered, but also as a group, they are able to make claims for certain benefits that they're going to get together. And actually, as I was there, when I was doing the research with them in 2017, they were negotiating the final, dotting the final I's and crossing the final T's of their collective reparations that they were going to be receiving from the state. And what this meant for them was continued funding for their healing processes and their healing practices, but also a meeting house where women could come together, they could work, they could earn a living. So they were cooking, they were engaging in, what did they do? They cooked products. They wanted to hold a catering or create a catering company. They sewed clothes and they wanted to sell these clothes. They had a daycare where they took care of children in the neighborhood and their own children. And they wanted to be able to earn a wage, knowing that they were in a safe place, their children were in a safe place, and that they could make money to take care of their families. And this, since I finished research, I think that they now do have their meeting house, which belongs to them, and they're beginning to engage in these activities. However, again, participating in this organization did not come without risks. Maria Eugenia herself was kidnapped and was kidnapped from Usme with her cousin. They were taken to the outskirts of Bogota. They were sexually tortured for 10 days and then they were eventually released. And this was because not only were they encouraging women to mobilize and to make claims for gender justice, but also they were calling out the local armed groups who were recruiting their children in Usme. And in doing so, they represented a threat to these armed groups. So the armed groups used sexual violence against them to try and make them stop, to try and silence them. But Maria Eugenia and the organization continued. They continue to make these demands for gender justice, despite the ongoing violence in the communities where they live. I'll go through a little bit more quickly on this case. Again, this is the case of the negative case I mentioned. This is La Soledad in La Guajira. It's not actually called La Soledad. This is a pseudonym that I was asked to use by the participants, but it's in an area that has experienced historical paramilitary and paramilitary violence, particularly because it's right close to the border with Venezuela, which is a hotbed for trafficking and for contraband. And we see here, this is in the outskirts of Riohacha, which is the departmental capital, that it's a really similar population of women who I met with and started working with. They're the same in terms of levels of education, in terms of socioeconomic conditions, in terms of race and ethnicity, in terms of the violences that they've suffered. However, they don't mobilize. And this is really interesting to me because they had so many of the same characteristics as the women, both in Usme and in El Pozón. It's not to say that there was zero level of organization. I did see that they would get together, they would hang out. There was a woman who they considered kind of informally their leader, Estefania, who would chat with them, who would hold meetings in the garden of this, which is her house. And what was interesting to me, though, is that they didn't have this broader vision of gender justice. And I really wondered why. And what I found is that what I found, though, is that although she's considered a leader, she doesn't have this broader vision of framing that Maria Eugenia and Patricia Guerrero did have. So she wasn't able to tell women that they shouldn't think in terms of fear, but that they should think in terms of anger and resistance. She didn't have the ability, for whatever reason, to create bonds with other organizations or other institutions to get material benefits. She didn't have a broader vision of bringing women together under this bandera or flag of solidarity. And so what we see there is that even though she's a great leader and she's a kind leader and she is a compassionate leader, she's not a charismatic leader in the way that we need to forge these bonds of the charismatic bond, which then allows women to justify taking on that extra risk of mobilizing. And so we see that even though they mobilized they didn't mobilize, they operated in the same domain of losses, the same domain of violence, of ongoing threats, of ongoing danger in the neighborhood where they were. They didn't come together collectively to make broader demands for gender justice. And thus they're not actually an example of high-risk feminism. But we see, and there's a scholar who talks about leadership, and she tells us that as scholars of social movements, we must be as concerned about who becomes a leader as by who does not. And so that's why I included this case, to really talk about who does not and what that tells us about high-risk feminism in itself. Finally, because of time, I'm just going to talk really briefly about Putumayo. So this is Sandra's case. What we saw in Putumayo was really similar. We see that women came together to make demands for women's rights and to make demands for gender justice, despite the incredibly high risks of violence that they were facing in the late 90s and early 2000s. What we see, though, and this is why I wanted to talk about it in terms of Coburn's understanding of the gender continuum of violence, is that these women came together to mobilize similarly and make demands similarly to their counterparts in other parts of the country. And then as the peace process got closer and drew closer, things got safer. The paramilitaries demobilized nominally or ostensibly in between 2005 and 2007. Things got calmer and more peaceful in Putumayo. It wasn't great necessarily, but it was a lot more peaceful than it had been. And then we see through the peace process that women were really encouraged to go out and be leaders for reconstructing and rebuilding social fabric in communities that had suffered violence. And so the Alianza, the women of the Alianza were out there, they were in the front, they were talking to the demobilized FARC, they were holding fairs, they were holding events where they were able to denounce. They were building peace and again, as I say, reweaving this social fabric in the aftermath of 52 years of armed conflict with the FARC. However, as I mentioned and kind of hinted to, like in many other parts of the country, as the FARC demobilized, they left power vacuums that, particularly in Putumayo, were filled almost immediately, within about 2 or 3 years, by other armed groups who wanted to take over the coca plantations, the coca which is used for cocaine production, and the rivers and terrestrial roads or routes which allow for shipping of this of cocaine overseas. And so these armed groups came in, and what did they do? The first thing they started to do was to target these women. So Sandra was telling me in an interview, and I have it here, she said, when we began the peace process, it was beautiful. I felt an incredible inner peace. Until about 2017, it was beautiful, but since then there have been setbacks. And then I spoke with Fatima, who's the leader of the Alianza, and she said to me, they don't want people to be organized. So who do they threaten? She's talking here about the new armed groups. She says they threaten the leaders. We women are organized and we have fuerza, strength or force. There are many of us, so they know that when they hurt one of us, they hurt all of us. But we're going to create the scandal of the century. United women are very dangerous, they say. And so what we see here is that women who were encouraged by international organizations, by international governments, by the Colombian government to go out and really create peace in their neighborhoods are being targeted particularly for doing that. They're the victims of what we call, or what I've called in another article, patriarchal backlash. Again, not only did they make themselves visible, not only did they decide to create peace and to engage in this community cohesion in the aftermath of war, but now they're being targeted for doing so. And that's as a way to set examples for other organizations who may get notions that they could go out and engage in community cohesion as well. So I'm going to finish here, and I'm going to talk really briefly about what some of the implications are here. So what I wanted to say in this book with about high-risk feminism is that women's mobilization for gender justice is not something that naturally or automatically happens. It's not this immutable characteristic of women. It's actually a political phenomenon that requires explaining and requires explanation, which is what I try to do when I go through and explain how women are making these decisions to take on or to assume extra risk in the already violent communities where they live. As I said, we cannot assume that their mobilization simply takes shape. It's something that requires calculations. It requires something that requires building strategies. And these strategies that they use are context specific, and that they can change and they can shift to accommodate fluctuating patterns of violence in their communities. But this only becomes visible when we take a grassroots perspective of women's pursuit of gender justice. So what I really hope to have done in this book is to use the voices and the stories and the experience of women who don't always fall in the spotlight, who aren't always in Geneva or New York or Washington, DC, talking about what's happened to them. Some of the more middle-class women who do fantastic work for women's rights, but are often similar, they're the similar actors over and over. So I went to these territories where women live. I asked them about their experiences. I asked them about what's happening to them now. I asked them about what they want. And I asked them about how they make these decisions to take on the high risk collective action in ongoing territories shaped by violence. In terms of the broader implications, I think that this tells us a lot about the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda is a set of 10 United Nations Security Council resolutions that began in 2000, and they talk about women's differentiated experiences of war, and they also recognize that women have a unique role to play in post-conflict moments and in post-conflict peace building. However, as we see in the case of Putumayo, simply encouraging women to go and build peace or construct peace in their communities after war can actually expose them to further violences. So I think it tells us a lot about what we need to guarantee as an international community, as different embassies, as different INGOs, even as the national government, what needs to be done in terms of guaranteeing women's safety when they're participating in these actions. And I think it also asks us, when is war over for women? The war in Colombia, in theory, the way it's often spoken about is that it's over. The war between the FARC and the government is over. But war against women and the war against social leaders, both men and women, certainly isn't over. So I'm going to end just with one quote, which was originally said by Cristina Bautista, who's an indigenous leader who was murdered in Cauca a few years ago. And it's been taken up by a lot of different social leaders, including Francia Marquez, who's an incredible Afro-Colombian environmental defender, who's right now running to be the vice president in Colombia's upcoming elections. And what these women say is they say, if we're silent, they kill us. If we speak out, they kill us. So we may as well speak out. That's, in a nutshell, they put it in better words than I could have. That is high-risk feminism in Colombia. And as I mentioned, the book is now out. It should be available for order in English, but I'm really excited to also say that it's been translated and it's going to be coming out with Ediciones Uniandes and Fiscal Colombia in August or September of this year. So I will leave it there. I hope I've kept to time. Thank you so much, Maxine, for helping me organize this. Thank you to UCL Institute of the Americas. This has been a collective project with many of you here who, as I said, have listened to me drone on for years about social movement theory and about gender and conflict. And I'm just really appreciative that it's finally materialized and that I can share it with you today. So I think Maxine is now going to make some comments and then we can open up to questions for the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for a wonderful talk and really inspiring research and lessons to be drawn for all of us who are interested in supporting women's collective action and the advance of human rights in these contexts. I was very struck by your use of prospect theory to explain, as it were, how envisaging a future is important in helping to kind of shape the decisions women take about risk. And the very important point you make in explaining high-risk feminism is that, as you yourself said, it's if things are really bad and, involving yourself in collective action increases risk, but it also has its rewards at the same time in the form of female solidarity, support, sharing problems and being able to develop something concrete. And I think that comes across really strongly in your research, in all of your, the main case studies. And I think, there's so much to learn about, how women do think about issues of risk. And what struck me also in your work is the way that you talk about framing in terms of human rights, but also gender justice. And I mean, one of the things that we're certainly struck with in many contexts today is that there's a kind of sense of ennui about human rights, and people can be quite dismissive of the importance of rights and rights struggles. But I think your work shows very clearly how rights discourses, rights talk has penetrated into low-income populations with quite a lot of significance for them if they know how to access the rights discourse to make claims for justice in the various contexts in which they live. And I thought perhaps you could just tell us a little bit about how that happens, because I think it's quite important as an issue for trying to understand where we are now in terms of struggling for rights and women's rights in a context which is not very favorable, given the rise of authoritarianism in so many contexts.
Yes, I've made you big, and now I'm going to try and make myself big. There I am. No, absolutely. Thank you so much for those comments, Maxine. I think that it is so interesting to think about, gender justice and to think about this idea of justice and rights and what that means. And I'll bring it to a case that's really fresh in my mind because I was there about 3 weeks ago. I was in Guerrero in Southwest Mexico with an indigenous woman and her indigenous organization. This woman doesn't even speak Spanish. She speaks the local language, and she was violated by the state in the early 2000s. And she decided to come out of her small community, come down the mountain effectively, and start making claims for justice, saying, you know, this is what I deserve, that I have been violated by the state and I have rights. And she managed to take this claim with a human rights organization all the way through the Inter-American Commission to the Inter-American Court, and she won. She won a whole series of measures against the Mexican state. And when I spoke to her the other day and I said, you know, why did you decide to do this? You know, it was a risky activity. She suffered horrendous violence through the whole process of making these claims. She said, I don't want what happened to me to happen to anyone else. And I think that that's something that's really stuck with me, that feeling of solidarity, and also of having some kind of moral duty to expose these crimes of the state or of the different armed groups, and to use, again, as I said, that framing, that human rights language, those rights that exist in the Constitution or in various laws or through the autos in Colombia, to make demands on the state in their own language. It's not only to say, this happened to me and I don't like it, or this happened to me and it wasn't correct, but to say, you know, you lawyers in Bogota, you created this entire legal system, and we're now going to, from the grassroots, take hold of it, learn it, understand it, and use that language to make demands and to make claims on the responsibilities that you owe us. And so I think that that doesn't necessarily come automatically. Again, a lot of the women who I worked with don't necessarily have legal backgrounds, although some of the leaders do. But then again, it's that role of the leader in terms of the benefits that she's able to bring. Some of those benefits involve either educating and creating a consciousness around what rights exist. You know, what is the law against violence against women? What is the auto against displacement and the particular ways that women suffer displacement in Colombia? Getting to know and getting to feel comfortable with those legal measures, and then use them to their advantage, using that same language of the state. And so in the case of Patricia Guerrero, for example, she knew this language. She knew this was the way she talked. She was a lawyer. This was her lexicon. So she was able to talk the women through taking some of these claims and these experiences that they'd had, for example, through denuncias with the victims unit, or with bigger cases, for example, with the Inter-American Commission, and use that language in a sophisticated way to frame or to highlight what had happened to them, not only as uncomfortable or wrong, but actually as illegal and actually as requiring action. When it came to someone like Maria Eugenia, she didn't necessarily have a legal background. I don't even know if she finished secondary school, but she had this fantastic ability, which I talk about in the chapter, to connect the dots. So to find people who do know, to find the lawyers or to find the legal experts, and to find those people who did know how to use that language. She knew it existed, and she just needed to find someone who could come in and help facilitate framing or, you know, writing down these experiences in a way that is consistent with that legal architecture, which is so common in Colombia. And I think we see it in terms of strategic litigation in terms of other issues. For example, when we look at reproductive rights in Colombia in 2006, and then again earlier this year, it was through really strategic litigation and use of the frameworks and use of political opportunities within the Constitutional Court that feminist lawyers were able to firstly fully decriminalize abortions and access to abortion, so that it wasn't completely banned as it was pre-2006, but then also to make it more accessible. And that's just being, to be honest, really creative. And again, finding those loopholes or finding those strategic ways to take an architecture which isn't really designed necessarily for women, or isn't necessarily designed for the poor or the vulnerable, but to harness it and to make it useful using the same language, or using ways and framings that make it unignorable to those who do hold power. And so I think that, again, although we're seeing all over Latin America this kind of, as you say, ennui when it comes to human rights language, I think that there are still really powerful ways that social movements are trying to use it and trying to harness it and trying to continue to push through, so that what exists in many of the constitutions and legal systems, these progressive opportunities that exist on paper and don't really exist in practice, really trying to narrow that gap between the de jure and the de facto understanding and application of rights. It's not always successful, but I think that it's one of the main ways that we're seeing that progressive measures actually are, one of the only ways that we're seeing that progressive measures are taking shape, particularly in the conservative and frankly hostile political moment that we find ourselves in Latin America and in the United States and abroad.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that was a wonderful answer. Thank you, Julia. Perhaps we can open it up now to discussion, and people, you can put your questions or comments in the chat, and we can then call on you to speak if you want. Would anybody just like to start by making a contribution? Phoebe will let you in. So if you can signal that you'd like to do that.
Okay, I see a question from Luis Orlando, which says, how can one justify comparing women in big city contexts and women in isolated contexts, such as Soledad in La Guajira? I think that's a great question. And I think that when we look at the different intersections of vulnerabilities that women are facing, absolutely geography is one of them. Being women in the big city, in Usme and Bogota, and having the Alcaldía de Bogotá and having the bodies of the state right there next to you definitely does make a difference. And I think it's Diane Davis who talks about distance, and distance as being important when we talk about social movements. Distance not only in terms of geographical distance, but distance in terms of power from these, I guess, actors who do hold power. I think what we see, though, is that there are a lot of ways in which the women are similar. So demographically, they're all women who come from rural areas to begin with. So the women from Usme, they're not natives of Usme, they come from rural areas and they had to displace themselves to the city. We see that they're also, when it comes to their educational levels, to their lack of income, to the discriminations that they face based on race and ethnicity, and particularly gender, they hold a lot of similar factors. And so I think, yes, in terms of, if we're just looking at the material benefits that they were able to access, so for example, the women in Usme who were able to access collective reparations and actually get those pushed through by the Alcaldía de Bogotá and other state institutions, that probably is a function of them being close to the city. They can get on a bus, they can get on a Transmilenio, and physically make their presence seen and heard at these big institutions, whereas the women in La Soledad absolutely cannot. They're in Riohacha, La Guajira, I think, has had 5 or 6 governors in the last 5 or 6 years. It's not known for being a bastion of whatever the opposite of corruption is. It's known for being a hotbed of corruption and impunity. And so I think that their ability to access resources or material benefits definitely is not comparable when we think about Usme. However, what's interesting is if you look at the case of Turbaco, you're talking about Cartagena and Bolivar. Cartagena, yes, is a big city, but again, it's a city known for being incredibly corrupt when it comes to the government. They were living in a slum, an isolated slum, and Turbaco is, for all that it's close to Cartagena, it's still an hour and a half out. And actually one of the issues that women talked to me about a lot was not having money to take the bus to get into town. And so I think, what we see there is another rural example, or, semi-rural or semi-urban example, where we saw that women were able to be successful. And so I think that absolutely there are factors that, again, Putumayo, same thing. Mocoa is a pretty small town. It's a pretty rural town, and that's the departmental capital. But the women I was spending time with are in Bajo Putumayo, which is incredibly rural, like really small kind of hamlets almost. And they were able to make some of these material and gain some of these material and non-material gains. So I think that if we were to look more specifically at that rural urban divide, there definitely would be factors that would tell us that sometimes comparing is difficult, or there might be some flaws when it comes to comparing them as even. But I think that what we see is that even in semi-urban and then other rural communities, there were organizations that were able to have successes in the same way that Afro Mupas was. I think it's a great line of investigation. I would really like to, I've always been interested in that article that Diane Davis wrote about distance and how that does, how we can kind of operationalize that. But I don't know that it necessarily negates the power of comparability when it comes to the other cases, particularly because they were rural as well. But it absolutely does play into it. I see another case here. I was wondering if you had spoken to any of these women about some of the more recent political upheavals, for example, the Paro Nacional, and as you mentioned, the candidacy of Francia Marquez. Yeah, and so that is something with some of these organizations, and some of the women, I maintain close contact with, others not so much. And I'm actually writing a paper right now with Kieran, I think she's here, or she was here. We're writing a paper about the differences in the gendered differences in the nature of threats being received by men and women social leaders. And this is ongoing. And so I think when I speak to the women, what's really interesting is when I speak to them now, it's really interesting, again, going back to that idea of the gendered continuum of violence over time. They talk about the peace process and the build up to it as a moment of hope, as a moment of relative safety. Things were better in many of their communities in terms of their ability to participate collectively and be out there engaging in social movements. And since the demobilization of the FARC, for a lot of them, violence has ticked up. And they talk now, the way they talk about their communities and the risks that they run is in the same language as they talked to me about violences that they were experiencing in the late 90s and early 2000s before I met them and before I was even in Colombia. And so I think that they're very aware that while the signing of the peace accords meant at that moment this opportunity for hope, that it hasn't materialized. If you look even in the peace accords and the different organizations that are monitoring the implementations of the peace accords, which were hailed as being these internationally most gender sensitive peace accords in the world, the Kroc Institute shows, and I don't have the exact figures, they're in the book, that I think it's something like 40% of those pertaining to women and women's rights haven't even been implemented in the last, at this point, 5.5 years since the peace was signed. And I think that that's in large part a function of the conservative government, which came in after the government of Santos and really did its best to not implement a lot of what the progressive gains that were included in this accord. When I don't necessarily talk to them about the Paro Nacional so much, but I was talking to a woman the other day. I was interviewing her for this paper that Kieran and I are working on. And she is an indigenous Nasa woman. She's in Cauca, and she spoke about the Paro Nacional as, for her, this moment where she was exposed to significantly more violence, but violence not only at the hand of other armed actors like the paramilitaries, the new paramilitaries, the dissident FARC, but also the state. And so what I saw there in that interview and a few other interviews, again, was a linkage between her activism as a woman and the violence that she's receiving, not only from armed groups, but also directly from the state. And I suppose indirectly from the state in terms of the state's inability to implement or unwillingness to implement the peace accords, to implement guarantees of safety and protection, to implement investigations into the violences they're receiving. So I think that it's becoming more confusing, it's becoming more muddied. And one other thing, and this is perhaps a bit rambly, but it's a reflection that I think about quite a lot, which is that when I spoke recently-ish, 2019, it was 2020, it was during the beginning of the pandemic, I spoke again to some of the women in Putumayo and I said, how's this different from before? And they said, before you knew who you were dealing with. So before, if a child got recruited, I would go to the FARC commander and I'd say, give me my child back. Or I'd go to the paramilitary leader and I'd say, give me my child back. Or I'd go to the head of the army battalion and say, commander, give me my child back. And now, she said, now I don't know who to go to anymore. I don't know who these leaders are. I don't know what they want. I don't know what their ideological backgrounds are. I just know that they're threatening us. I just know that they're killing us. And I just know that they're really dangerous and we can't negotiate with them. And so I don't know, I'd have to think probably more about how that fits into the paro nacional, but for me, it was a really interesting reflection on how these different actors of violence have become muddied and made more murky, and in that sense, more frightening or even of higher risk to these social leaders, both men and women around the country, who feel as though they've lost some of their ability to play by the rules of the game or to subvert those rules of the game simply because they're different actors. And I think the ties with narco trafficking are much more explicit than perhaps they were in the past. The ties were obviously there in the past, but I think that any kind of guise or smokescreen of ideological background is really lost, or is really not considered legitimate in any way anymore when they're talking to these new armed actors. So I see Simon. Hi, Simon. Expand a little more on fieldwork. What challenges did you experience contacting, interacting, and researching with these communities, and how did I overcome them? I think one of the things that I had, which I felt really lucky with, was that Lee, my supervisor, and I had a really great relationship. And so that meant that I was afforded the ability to spend a really long time in Colombia. I went originally, and Maxine knows this, I went originally beginning my DPhil thinking that I'd go for a few months, and then I'd go to El Salvador, back to El Salvador, and then I'd come to Mexico, where I am now. And as I arrived, and as I was attending those peace rallies in 2016, August, September, I thought, no, I think I need to stay. I think I need to be here. Things are happening, things are unraveling. And I spoke to Lee, and we really spoke through some of the pros and cons of staying embedded, as it were, in Colombia for all those years versus going back to Oxford. And we decided that if I went back every few months, twice a year, that there wasn't necessarily a problem in keeping that field work happening over time. So I was able to stay in Colombia for the vast majority of the time I undertook my PhD, and then I stayed afterwards as well. I only moved here to Mexico in January. So I think what happened, because this is sensitive research, is that I was able to spend time with women. Someone recommended in a conference the other day an article about ethnographic returning. And I would talk maybe a bit about ethnographic staying. There's something to be said, I think, about going back time and time again, of creating these relationships of trust and friendship. Originally, people, they're kind of uninterested, or perhaps they say, like, what do we get out of this? You're coming to study us, what do you want? But if you just hang out and you just stay a long time, and you prove you actually, probably a bit annoying, you're just there all the time. I think that there is an understanding that you have intentions to actually really understand women's experiences and stories, and there's a level of appreciation around that. Not all of the women, I would say, feel that way. After Mupas, I spent over 10 months, I would go and visit them, but we never really created any kinds of personal bonds. I think that they were really busy and tied up in getting those collective reparations. And so they made time for me and they'd speak to me, but that there was a lot of time to sit out and hang out and chat, not so much. They were busy. Whereas in La Guajira, in Putumayo, in Bolivar, there was a lot of time to just sit on buses, or to sit around while someone was making dinner, or to engage in this kind of ethnographic hanging out that I think gives a more detailed understanding of what's going on. There were at times safety concerns. I never lived in the communities themselves because I was told that it would be a bad idea, not only for me, but also would just kind of attract attention. But I lived close by, or I would visit often. And I think that over time, building this network, not only of social leaders and women social leaders, but also of people within civil society, within think tanks, within advocacy groups, gives you the ability over time to kind of be embedded, to be a known entity, to enter with a bit of an informal background check. If you show up because someone has presented you, or X person has recommended you, that means that you're okay. You're already vouched for. And I think that being there for a long time really facilitated that. Simon, and then Nena. I'm wondering how the international human rights framework can support these women and make space for them, if at all, or should the human rights regimes stay out of these grassroots movements? I don't know that they should stay out of these movements. And I think that if we look, for example, Winifred Tate has some really amazing work, anthropological work about human rights and human rights discourse, and also the strategic links between organizations, civil society organizations and international human rights groups, and what that can mean, how those can be used strategically. And also Keck and Sikkink have this kind of model of a boomerang, where they say that sometimes at home, a small civil society group or advocacy group or rights group may make demands on their government that the government totally ignores. But the minute you bring in an international organization, so I don't know, WOLA, or for example, in the case of the Liga, this senator, it was Patrick Leahy actually, bringing in the big hitters from outside, you have a boomerang effect. So you throw the boomerang out to the international community and it comes back to pressure the national government in a way that they perhaps wouldn't have listened to this, rural backwater organization to begin with. But when you come in with the heavy hitters, then they have to take you seriously, or they have to engage with you. And I think that's one of the principles of international solidarity and international feminist solidarity. The peace brigades, for example, in Colombia, that was their kind of entire raison d'etre. But I do think that what can happen is when we have these international frameworks or standards or agendas. So again, I will go back to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which came out of the United Nations Security Council. I think what happens is there has to be room for bottom-up understandings and very context-specific understandings of what implementation looks like. And so if it's a top-down application, as I said, it looks fantastic. And this is by no means to undermine the fantastic work that the Women, Peace and Security community and the agenda more broadly does on the ground. But for example, one of the pillars is involving women in post-conflict reconstruction because of women-specific, the ways that women can specifically participate. And what we see is that can often translate or maybe get lost in translation into like, off you go, like go build peace in your communities. We'll give you $10,000 and you have 6 months to do it. And what that looks like is women who are having to compete for resources between organizations that may be allies. That's women who are having to learn how to deal with the minutia of reporting. And an example, this is not in any way to be disparaging of the Canadian government, but the Canadian government's feminist international assistance policy comes with this amazing idea and mission and vision. But when you have to come to filling in the accounting, you need a degree in accounting and Excel and internet and computers in order to be able to comply with their technical requirements. And there's very little flexibility in that often. So I think two things that could be taken into account, or three things perhaps. One is guaranteeing security for people who are participating. And that means asking women what security looks like for them. In Colombia, through the National Protection Unit, security often looks like, here you go, here's your bulletproof vest, here's your cell phone, maybe here's your armored car. If you're lucky, here are 2 men who come from a private security company who are going to accompany you everywhere you go. And if you speak to women on the ground, they say like, that doesn't protect me. That's not what I want at all. And so it's asking what security looks like and being flexible around that, particularly when it comes to Indigenous women, around understandings of protection that also involve the spiritual or the different cosmovisions that they hold. It's also looking at funding that is flexible and more long-term. This development complex of a 6-month project or a 1-year project, and you always have to innovate and always has to be new, doesn't really work when sometimes women say like, what we're doing is working. We just need the funding to be stable and happen over time. And we will continue to meet the needs of our community, but we can't do that if the outcomes are being dictated from Ottawa or New York or Geneva. And then I think thirdly, it's again being flexible in terms of women's restrictions. So many of the women I think all of the women I work with have children. And so that means that anytime there's an event, you better be providing childcare and transport for their kids and food for their kids as well. Otherwise, they're not going to participate. They're often doing it on a voluntary basis anyway. And so I think it's just putting this gender lens over women's realities when it comes to funding, when it comes to security, when it comes to participation. And from above, listening to those voices, listening to those pretty simple often demands and incorporating those into agendas that, Tara Cookson might talk about some of the unintended consequences that come from really well-meaning policies. and just having that dialogue between top down and bottom up that facilitates women's participation. So I think it's actually really important that the international community participate, but that also involves an exercise in listening to those who are acting on the ground. And Maxine has done so much work on this. So I mean, I don't know if you want to chip in there and add anything, but this is, I know, very much your wheelhouse as well. You're on mute, Maxine.
I so agree with you, Julia. It's so many years that those of us who are trying to get support for women's movements and recognition for grassroots women's movements in the international donor community. And it's a dialogue of the deaf, because they do not do it. And only reluctantly. There's slight change, you know, when they want to put money here and there, but there isn't a general recognition of the importance of, you know, grassroots mobilizations, what women are doing in their communities, fighting for human rights, peace building, or whatever it is. It's there's still a long way to go. And as you say, they don't listen enough. They don't listen to the grassroots organizations, and they don't, for that reason, when they do intervene, they don't always get it right. So all of your comments, I think, are absolutely correct. So they do need to listen more. And I think your book will bring people to see, because you set it out so meticulously what these women are doing, how tough it is, how they keep going, what they accomplish. These are extraordinarily significant case studies that you've brought to our attention. I think there will be a lot of learning coming out of your book. So I noticed that your mama has said that she found it readable, your book, which I must say for an academic book is a high accolade, because it not only does a very good scholarly job, but it is also incredibly readable. So I certainly second that comment. I don't know if that is our last comment, Julia. But
there's one more that I saw from
okay.
Nancy. And Nancy, for those of you who don't know her, she's here, and we did our DPhils together, and she's just recently finished her DPhil, which looks at Indigenous women leaders' mobilization against mega projects in Honduras, in Mexico, and Colombia. So it's another one to follow, and I definitely hope that the book is coming soon, because I'm excited about that. Nancy, I haven't given the book to them yet because it's not yet in Spanish, but the idea was around translating it, is that I'm going to be able to take it back. I have an event that I'll be doing with Fiscal, one of the German organizations. Hopefully we can invite the women. That's the idea, to invite social leaders. I hope you can come if you're around. I would love that. And the idea is to give it back to them when it can be in their own language. I mean, I will say that giving back has sometimes, you know, for me has been a process of learning. When I worked with the Liga, I remember saying, I published this article, would you like me to come and tell you about it? And they were like, no, we don't care. So, I mean, I think that for them, an academic article, you know, may not be the most accessible, which is why I am excited for the book and the event, and hopefully that event can be made in dialogue and created in dialogue, and give them a space to speak as well. And then, Mom, thank you for your comment. I'm glad that you're here. And I will say again, and it's in the acknowledgements, but my mother has over the years attended so many of these events with me. You know, I think she thinks that most people's mothers go on holiday to visit their daughters in Cartagena and go to the beach and go to the cathedral and go to the museum. And I took her on a really scary bus ride where we sat under the hot sun for about 5 hours and she listened to a peace protest. So I appreciate your ongoing involvement and support, Mom. And thank you for being here. And to my Auntie Kath as well, who is also here. I really appreciate that. It's not every day that I get to share my work world with my family world. And to everyone else, thank you so much for attending. I think that those were all the questions. Maxine, thank you for organizing. Thank you for being here. I will say one more thing and then I'll finish. In that when I was a young baby academic deciding what to do after my undergrad, I had read about Maxine's work and I emailed her saying, you know, what should I do for my thesis? And I remember you very kindly said, like, why don't you start your classes and do some reading and see what your supervisor says. And that was at this point about 12 years ago. So you really have been on board the whole time. And I so appreciate your ongoing engagement. And I really hope that you liked the book.
I love the book, and more to come, more engagement to come.
More to come.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, all the very best of luck with the ongoing research. And it's a wonderful opportunity for you to share it with our community here. And again, I'd like to thank you so hugely for coming to us, and also to our participants and audience, also to Phoebe and to the Institute. So yes, a very, very wonderful evening. And Julia, you deserve a rest. And I only wish you were here so we could actually all get together and have a drink and further chat, but it's not permitted at the moment because of travel and everything else. But in the future, we'll look forward to that.
I'll let you know. Thank you so much to everyone. Thank you, Phoebe. Thank you, Maxine.
Well, very, very good. Good night, everyone. And we will have more events and wonderful talk from Julia we look forward to in the future for your next stage in the research. Right.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Yeah, I'll stop the recording now.
Thank you.